All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson. I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA UConn speaker session entitled Compendium of Recommendations for Countering Russian and Other State-Sponsored Propaganda. And I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Todd Helmus, for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of our brief today. So during the presentation or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your questions through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom of your screen. And also make sure to submit all of your questions today to Ms. Mariah Yeager. Questions that are not submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed. So please make sure to send your questions to Mariah, who's marked as questions today. So send your questions to questions. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address your question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. So now please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Dr. Todd Helmus. Dr. Helmus is a psychologist at the RAND Corporation, where he studies terrorism, strategic communications, and disinformation. So Dr. Helmus, I will stop sharing my slides so that you can begin sharing yours.
Share screen. All right. Hang on here. Thank you very much. Really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to this group and to be back again. So thank you. So this study, it's well known by now that Russia is using propaganda to target the United States and its allies. It goes back, obviously, to 2016 when Russia invested all sorts of resources on this topic, putting out some 10 million tweets, 1,000 YouTube videos, 116,000 Instagram posts, not to mention 60-some thousand Facebook posts, in an effort to not only influence the course of the election, but I think more pertinently to help divide, in an effort to divide Americans from one another, which was really a key objective of their campaign. And Russia's continued this work with well-known campaigns detected on up to most recently for the 2020 election. RAND even put out a report that documented some of this stuff. Accounts that looked very Russia-like, and Iran and China are getting in the game. So scholars have been addressing this issue since 2016. Fairly substantively, they've offered a large number of reports, have offered a large number of recommendations for countering foreign propaganda. And so this study sought to try to make sense of that for you, the user. So we sought to do a systematic review to try and code and analyze these recommendations. We systematically searched for think tank reports that offered, basically offered recommendations on Russian propaganda. We used a search query that sought to bring in a large number of reports. We reviewed all those reports for our qualifications. Really, the biggest qualification was they needed a recommendation section. We avoided reports that just sort of embedded their recommendations in long narrative text. We really looked for a chapter or a section that addressed these topics. 46 studies qualified for review, and there's surely more than 46 studies that have been done on this topic. We did not look at the academic literature on this mainly because the academic literature generally does not do policy recommendations. Most of the studies that we looked at focused on propaganda issues. I'm now looking at these figures at the bottom. So most looked at propaganda. Most were published in 2018 and 19. 2020 was when we were still doing this study. I think we put our cap on publications around beginning of December 2020, so we could finish this project. And then most of these institutions are based in the US, and there's surely bias that's brought about from the search program that we use to collect these things. So we identified 5 categories of recommendations, and I'll sort of run through these really quick here, and then we'll go into in depth. The first figure you see is platform policies, which nearly 30 papers talked about. About 45 papers talked about government policies. 27 addressed coordination and synchronization efforts. Awareness and education initiatives were a focus of some 24, and then a smaller number talked about supporting media. So let's talk about each of these. Hopefully this will work out well, given the number of recommendations. First is platform policies. So obviously the platform policies are important because that's where the propaganda is taking place. And the most common recommendation here is to improve detection and removal. And these items here on the slide go through the different recommendations for platform policies, and the number refers to the number of papers that address that. So obviously they got to detect and remove this stuff. It's easier said than done. It's a bit of an arms race, as you're all familiar with, because Russia's changing and evolving their tactics on this front. So what may have worked to remove 2016 content probably won't work today. Russia's certainly not paying in rubles anymore for their online ad accounts. So basically, studies urge investing in better technologies, preventing bots from following, liking, sharing, and retweeting, and providing more transparent content removal policies. Advertising is a big issue. Russia spent about $100,000 on advertising on Facebook alone, which is actually, if you've ever done Facebook advertising, that's a huge number, given how economical Facebook actually is for advertising. So, one of the most common things here is talking about Senator Warner's Honest Ads Act, which is fairly basic, right? I mean, it argues that internet advertisers have to identify who purchased the ad, just like is the case with TV and radio content. And the platforms have made some headway on that. I think Facebook now identifies political ads, paid for by political ads, though Russia does more than just do political ads. Another area related to online advertising is improving privacy controls, because the platforms rely on all that information that we enter into our Facebook accounts, the groups, the posts we like and share, the comments we make, as well as the groups that we participate in. It's all logged in at Facebook, and it helps places like Russia know who to target for their campaigns, or to actually reach them. So I think here the recommendation is not for Facebook to do away with their advertising regimen, but to maybe give users more options to modify the signals, like what Facebook can use for its advertisements, as well as regulations that talk about ensuring greater consumer privacy and protections, like notifying consumers when their data are being shared, like with data brokers and things like that. 8 studies talked about adjusting the algorithms. And, yes, you have to deprioritize Russian content, and not all Russian content is illegitimate. There are RT and Sputnik is out there, and you'd want Google to deprioritize those news feeds, that news information. So that makes sense. But also, like, demoting sensational and divisive content. A lot of the content that's breeding disinformation, political partisanship today is fake news on Facebook and other platforms. Problem is, Facebook's been really reluctant to address this. I'm showing a picture here of the guy who ran Facebook's AI algorithm program. And there was a really interesting MIT technology paper that was written on this guy, and just the degree to which Facebook has been reluctant to tweak their algorithms to deprioritize this content, mainly because the content sells, and it keeps people liking and engaging on Facebook. Next one is revising membership policies. Some urge the need to confirm someone's identity when they log on, when they create a new account, like on Twitter or Facebook. Others argue that that's really bad because there are folks in overseas authoritarian countries who you wouldn't want their real name attached to their account. One approach to get around that is just simply using CAPTCHAs. CAPTCHA, we've all done the CAPTCHA thing to help ensure that at least organizations are not using bots to create massive numbers of these accounts. And finally, improving information sharing on platforms. The GIFCT is the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. It's a really helpful model for the platforms to coordinate and collaborate on extremist content. And they need something like this on the disinformation side. To be able to share information that they're getting. So Facebook learns about a Russian campaign, they should share that with Twitter. to find out. So Twitter can check that box, but also sharing best practices, particularly important for new platforms. TikTok, for example, it's not so new, but they're new enough that they're struggling with this content, and they could probably learn a thing or two from the larger platforms. All right, so that's the platform side. Next, we have a tranche of these things for government policies. And these are the government policies. The most common one was supporting at-risk countries. The big at-risk countries here are probably those on the Eastern European side, in Eastern Europe, especially those along Russia's border, where Russia is really doing a wholesale campaign to try and influence Russian speakers in those regions, and to stoke distrust for NATO and the European Union. The recommendations for supporting these countries really varies along the map, from supporting media and journalism, countering corruption, supporting rule of law, building democracy, supporting economic development, strengthening minority rights. There's just a lot of things that could be done and that are being done to support these areas. The next most common one fall along the deterrence, and I'll talk about deterrence and sanctions together. The papers sort of address these a little bit differently. One is deterrence. You need to send a clear, consistent warning that state-sponsored meddling will be met with penalties, right? It's an articulation of red lines, an articulation of what will happen if someone crosses those red lines, and actually following through on that. And that's what a deterrence policy is. That had been missing under the Trump administration. I think a lot of folks, when Biden met Putin, was hoping that there would be some articulation of this. Clearly, Biden issued a warning, but I'm not aware, and he urged there would be consequences. I don't think the NSC has determined what those consequences would be and for what type of violation. But either way, deterrence also requires a clear messaging of what that strategy is. And then there's the sanctions side. And the sanctions side, basically, in the way the academic literature points this out, is just punishing Russia for what they've already done. They've already screwed up. They've already violated all sorts of international norms by attempting to influence U.S. elections. So there's a need to punish them with sanctions. And the literature talked about types of sanctions, like coordinating with allies on sanctions, identifying conditions for removal of sanctions, which is sort of maybe the opposite of deterrence, gaming out Russian responses to these sanctions, targeting culpable individuals. There's already been a lot of sanctions. I've heard the phrase that we're sanctioned out when it comes to Russia. We probably need to come up with other ways of punishing them. And by the way, the last set of sanctions was issued, I think, in May this year for efforts that Russia is doing with the 2020 election. So intelligence. Obviously, intelligence is a big name in this game because you need to be able to detect this content, and you don't want to outsource U.S. security on this issue to Facebook and Twitter. So the intelligence community needs to get ramped up on this topic, particularly in open source capabilities, so they can work to review content. I guess Twitter is the one platform that they could actually do a lot of work investigatorily on to identify content. But either way, they need to be in the game of helping to identify what Russia is doing in these particular area, and maybe even declassifying intel on foreign actors so that it could be issued with warnings. Improving information dissemination and public diplomacy. So here, scholars basically urge, the main thing is scholars urge that the administration send a clear message that foreign interference isn't tolerated, which I think certainly is happening more now under Biden. Other recommendations talk about publicizing foreign disinformation, creating a positive U.S. image, sharing lessons learned. The name and shame game came up, of course, that is something that's commonly referred to. And then improving cyber capabilities. It's well known that disinformation, cyber attacks are a paired phenomenon. It was certainly the case in 2016 when Russia hacked the DNC elections. And the information that they pulled from that hack helped inform their propaganda campaign to discredit Hillary Clinton in the election. So, so this comes up in this conversation about propaganda. One is detecting cyber attacks. Second is improving protection. And the third thing these papers talk about is improving offensive capabilities. So no surprise, those are the three topics that you'd think would be hit with cyber policy, but it's important to recognize that role in this game. And finally, national security strategy. I think it's notably absent that there's a national security strategy on this topic. Only 4 papers talked about this, but it seems incredibly important, especially with a large number of actors involved in countering disinformation, that there would need to be some sort of strategy that would pull them all together. My hope is that that's something that the administration is working on now. All right, so that's the whirlwind on government policies. Now we'll talk about coordination efforts. And like I just said, there's a lot of different actors involved in countering Russian disinformation. It's a worldwide game. It's an interagency game, along with many others. And so we sort of highlighted what the literature highlights on that topic. So the first area is on interagency coordination, and especially those who have experience doing strategic communications work will recognize the long challenge that the US has had in coordinating and synchronizing the interagency just to be able to communicate a clear and consistent message. So the challenge of that, I think, is well understood. Here, the recommendations basically talk about creating some sort of structure, some sort of architecture that can improve collaboration across the government. They include either designating a lead agency, a lead cabinet official, a senior level coordinator in the NSC, or create an interagency fusion cell like the National Counterterrorism Center, or just an office, at least an office in ODNI or the NSC that is focused on this issue. And maybe there's something at ODNI. I don't think there's something at the NSC, and I don't think they've created any sort of structure. Second is intergovernment. Obviously, Russia's in the worldwide propaganda campaign business. They influence governments on its border. They've tried to influence the French elections, the German elections, Brexit, obviously the US effort. So this requires a worldwide response, and that response needs to be coordinated on some level. So here the recommendations talk about countering disinformation, developing a counter disinformation coalition that can share intelligence. Obviously, we need to share intelligence on this issue, and we need to share best practices for countering it. Particularly like some of the countries, like the Nordic countries, are very sort of, I think, evolved on this topic because they've been dealing with it for some time, and there's certainly lessons that we could learn from there. Collaboration on operations, on investigations, on detection, on treaties, and then as well as strengthening organizations like this one I'm highlighting here, which is STRATCOM NATO COE, or Center of Excellence. It's a, for those who aren't familiar, it's a really good organization. They do a lot of interesting work coordinating and synchronizing NATO activities on this topic and putting out reports based on their experts, their international cadre of experts. So, this type of activity is something that's certainly supported in the literature. Public-private accounts, here the recommendations were pretty much uniform, that there needs to be a standing organizational body that brings together US government, US intelligence, and the platforms. And then I think this body needs to meet regularly, and they need to build relationships, and they need to share intelligence on some level. And to my knowledge, this sort of standing body coordination mechanism, I think, is today more haphazard than what the literature is envisioning. It's more that if something comes up, that you can pick up a phone and contact someone in the platforms. But I think it needs to be standing, and it needs to be more synchronized and thoughtful than probably it's happening right now. And finally, there's a civil society piece. I think the way the disinformation game is done, it's really, I think governments can develop plans, governments can do funding. A lot of the work is done by civil society. It's a lot of gumshoe work related to building up journalism skills, doing detection, identifying fake news, doing fact checking, building support for civil society. So, civil society plays a big role in this. And the US has, I think the governments have to fund the work of civil society that they're doing in these areas. And I think also, and I hate to say this, but there's a need for conferences on this, basically, because there needs to be networking that's done between government and civil society. There needs to be sharing of best practices. And unfortunately, the best way to do that is by getting people together and sharing a room. All right, awareness and education. So here, the biggest recommendation so far focuses on media literacy. 24 studies highlight this. There's actually one other study that sort of did a coding of the literature and documented this as well. I'd also say it seems to be the area where there's the least momentum, unfortunately. We know from research that media literacy is effective. There's been at least one systematic review that looked at this literature back in 2012. There was another researcher that did a study that demonstrated the impact of Facebook's media literacy content. And we also, in this Russian propaganda study that I'm highlighting here in the slide, we also did a study that demonstrated the effectiveness of a media literacy video in helping right-wing audiences better limit their sharing of Russian right-wing propaganda content. So there's a lot of evidence that works. I think they need to put this stuff in the schools. They need to find other ways of getting adults educated on this. And then, I think getting the stuff in the online world will help be able to disseminate content at scale. And if I hadn't said it, I think the obvious reason for this is because, all these efforts that we're talking about will ultimately not be 100% effective. So the only fail-safe in this is to improve the end user's ability to discriminate and to not be influenced by this content. I think another way to help end users not be influenced and influenced by this content is through public warnings about propaganda. There's actually some scientific research that suggests that public warnings about propaganda, warnings about the nefarious intent of propaganda, of particular pieces of propaganda, is effective. That study I just showed you earlier, we showed that that providing a label that shows that a particular meme came from Russia actually did a lot to reduce the influence and effectiveness of that Russian propaganda meme. So these types of announcements are important. What you're seeing here is an announcement from DHS about an impending warning on Russian efforts to influence the 2020 election, I think. So they put out a few of these things and they're helpful. I'll also note that that these things have been used fairly well. I think there's been an effort to disseminate warnings within the EU that have been effective in helping galvanize government officials on this topic. And they've been used in a number of other places, from the French elections to other sort of European efforts. Finally, there is fact-checking. Fact-checking involves a couple things. One is there's a need to improve journalist capabilities to do fact-checking, and I'll talk more about journalists in a second. But there needs to be an expansion of sort of the fact-checking abilities from civil society. There's basic fact-checking networks for journalists. There's other efforts like factcheck.org, PolitiFact, and the German Marshall Fund's Hamilton 68 dashboard, which is a great resource if you haven't seen it. So those are important. I think there's also a huge role in social media to put this out. There's been several summative studies that suggest that social media efforts to do fact-checking, like real-time corrections or crowdsourced fact-checking or algorithmic tagging, can successfully mitigate the effects of misinformation. So, so this type of content, this type of intervention is fairly effective and should be expanded. All right, so the last one I'll talk about is supporting media. All right, so we talk about, one is supporting journalism, and here it's sort of an at home and abroad piece. At home, there's a need to improve the standards and training for US-based journalists. In fact, my colleagues at RAN are going to be doing an event next week for news media organizations and journalists, local news media organizations and journalists, to help them understand what disinformation is, how Russia is trying to use it, and what they as journalists can do about it. So there's that education piece that has to happen. There's also a need to support journalists overseas, that those particularly working in at-risk countries like, I don't know, Ukraine and the Baltics, to help improve their networks, their own capacity, and to improve their investigative journalism skills. Foreign broadcasts play a big time. And again, it's sort of there's a US-based and there's an Allied-based broadcasting effort, the BBC, for example, from the Brits. The US has Current Time, which is a Russian language TV news program that reaches audiences not only in, I think, in Russia, but also Eastern Europe. And these are helpful because there's a need to counter Russia's heavy weight in that region, in Eastern European in particular, where, say, in the near abroad, like the Baltics on down to Ukraine, Russia has really owns a huge market for the Russian-speaking population in terms of cable TV and news programming. So there's a need to counter that. And Current Time from the US is one way of doing that. Another way is doing it more locally. So there's ETV, which is the logo you see here, which is a I'm trying to remember if that is a hang on here. Oh yeah, that's an Estonian Russian language cable television station that's meant to provide the Russian language Estonians some like medium decent source of facts and information. So again, helps counter what Russia's doing in that space. And finally, online creators is another way of pushing out content. We talked about this in one of our reports where we identified, there's a huge information game going out that's playing from civil society to civil society. In our previous report, we detected some 40,000 pro-Russia, anti-Ukraine Twitter accounts that were going sort of head to head with another 40,000 anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine Twitter accounts. So there's an information fight that's playing out at the civil society and even just at the regular person level. And, there's probably ways to support that. I know that the West, for example, had been funding efforts to help train YouTube influencers in Eastern Europe, Russian language YouTube influencers, to help them put out compelling, authentic content that provides Russian language linguists in the region some alternative vision for the future other than Russia. So that type of content is important. So those are the sort of broad swath of recommendations we went through in our study that we documented in our study. I think there's a couple observations here. One, there's a lot of things. It's a very complex issue, a complex and challenging issue that requires a large number of vectors and policies to successfully address. It's relatively easy to put out content on social media, as you all know. So deterring and preventing Russia from doing so, or China or Iran, is a big challenge. It requires a lot of things and a lot of steps. So I think that, to me, that's the biggest takeaway from this project, that there's just a large number of areas to address to effectively counter this thing. In terms of current status of these things, I'll just note that the platforms have made a lot of significant strides against propaganda. But most of it has been on their own account. There's been almost no regulation on this topic, as you're aware. And I'd say their effects are somewhat haphazard, and that more is needed from the platform side to be able to effectively address this. And it will require continued investment of resources from the platforms. USG works to support overseas allies. So the USG has done a lot. I think USG has done a lot to supporting overseas allies. They've levied a lot of sanctions on this topic against Russia, but they struggled to sort of develop a coherent deterrent policy and to develop a strategy, and a coherent counter propaganda strategy is noticeably absent. So, and then 14 states so far have mandated media literacy education in their school curriculums, but a lot more is needed on that front. So I'll just leave it right there and be happy to take questions.
All right, thank you, Dr. Helmus. Let me go ahead and adjust the screen view, but go ahead and stop sharing your slides. All right, and there we go. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of today's Zoom Gov session. So feel free to keep submitting your questions through the Q&A chat. All right, so our first question is from Alexandra Trani, and the question is, you mentioned having conferences to help with networking. What can we do to help reduce these and other similar conferences from being used for nefarious recruitment, in air quotes?
So that's a good. I think that's a good question. I think one of the last conferences I was at, it was a clear. I don't know. It seemed like a Russian intelligence agent that was there. I don't have I've never read anything on that topic. It's an interesting question. Um, so I don't know. I think obviously Russia's doing a lot on their sort of intelligence networking side. So I imagine it'd be hard to create a conference that they couldn't be able to insert someone into. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I think, if these things are done in sort of in the West, and I don't know. I think it's a risk that you take when you do these things.
Great, thank you, Dr. Helmus. This next question comes from Kirill Avramov, and the question is, what specific features or functions of NATO Stratcom can be adopted or modified for best use here in the US?
What specific features or functions of NATO can be adopted? That's a good question. I don't really have a great answer to that. I would welcome anybody with answers to put those in the comments. But I guess I don't understand. I don't specifically know what features of NATO would be best to apply here.
All right, thank you. The next question comes from Larry Kuznar, and this question is, did the recommendations that you reviewed elaborate on how media literacy training could be delivered? Could you elaborate on who could be reached and how?
I mean, the methods are pretty broad. It could be classroom instructions. So, and there are efforts to create classroom instructions for all different age levels. I think an organization called IREX is doing classroom instruction in Ukraine and other places to reach older populations. They certainly need to put this in the school curriculum to be able to reach and influence those folks, younger audiences. So, but I think also they need to be able to put the stuff online. So we're hoping to be able to do more work on this, helping organizations like IREX inform their efforts to develop video content, memetic content. I think the memes that we studied in our recent study, we studied both memes and videos. The video content appeared effective, but the memes less so. But I think you would just have to do a little bit more to develop memes that were relevant to your target audiences.
All right, thank you. You were just talking a little bit about measures of effectiveness, and this question comes from Joshua Cook. And he says, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on applying metrics to the recommendations to create a running tally of how well we're doing in addressing the problems at hand.
Yeah, that would be nice to do. I agree. That is something we would like to do. And I think once things in Afghanistan settle down, which seem to be sucking my energy and that of many others, that's hopefully something we'll be able to do. I think my own plans on doing that, absent any sort of funding, is to do it more casually through op-eds and what have you. But yeah, we'd like to be able to do something more systematic to tabulate the degree to which these recommendations are being enacted. And I should also note too that this was sort of an internally funded study. The resources were limited, so there wasn't a lot of opportunity to get the perspective of outside the academic community. So you'd want to know what how government officials are viewing these recommendations, what their plans are, what their view and the strengths and weaknesses of these efforts, as well as other implementers, as well as trying to do a running tally on how these are implemented.
All right, thank you, Dr. Helmus. So this next question comes from Will Dawson, and the question is, in the awareness and education category, were there any recommendations on just basic critical thinking skills, irrespective of media?
Well, I think that's that's a good challenge. That's a good point. I think so you can have media literacy education, but then there's a broader critical thinking piece. And I think it's hard to overstate the challenge of any attempt to improve media literacy skills in the United States, because I think you run into this problem with critical thinking and just education in general. The educational system, the media literacy programming will only be as effective as people's sort of broader critical thinking skills and capabilities are. So So obviously there'd be a lot of those in the population that struggle with that because of lack of just general education, poor support at home, various reasons. And so, yeah, I think critical thinking represents sort of a ceiling effect that you'd get on any sort of media literacy education.
All right, thank you, Dr. Helmus. Someone asked you in the chat if you can share the list of fact-checking sites that were mentioned, or are they in the RAND report, which I did share to the community in the chat.
I'll find them. They're in the report, but I'll find them.
Okay.
There are others though besides that we listed. We just listed a couple.
All right, thank you. Okay, this next question comes from Ross Owens, and this question is: is there any research that looks at whether live fact checking or disclaimers on social media posts may actually be pushing vulnerable minds further into the misinformation funnel due to the lack of trust in the fact checking source?
Yes, there are. So it's interesting because I'm aware of some of those studies. The studies that we cited in our report are sort of summative systematic review studies where actually they're not even systematic review studies, they're meta-analytic studies where they basically take a large cohort of studies and put their data into a file program and then analyze sort of the effects of these overall studies. I think overall these fact-checking programs efforts have been shown to be effective. I think there are challenges though in how these are used and implemented with certain audiences. I would say with audiences that are sort of in the deep depths of say a conspiracy theory or partisan viewpoints are probably, I think the research will show it, they're more difficult to reach and influence. So these fact-checking efforts are certainly a lot better with general audiences, and they probably effects are probably not as good with audiences that have more extreme views. And probably those with really extreme views, these are even least effective. We just published a study on conspiracy theories, and we reviewed the literature on that topic. And certainly efforts to like engage with conspiracy theorists, you can get a bounce back effect. Whereas, when you disseminate information attempting to change someone's minds, if people already have an extreme position, that information can actually make their viewpoints even worse. So, yeah.
All right, thank you. An anonymous person acknowledges that you've been talking a bit about right wing specifically, but he was asking if you took a look at any like left wing concerns, inferences, or implications in your study.
So in our study on Russian propaganda hits its mark, we basically, for that study, we surveyed 1,500 people in the state of California that include a broad spectrum, left wing to right wing. Russia targets its content to left and right wing audiences. So for example, they'll tell African Americans don't vote, or tell African Americans to sort of give up on society because they've already been screwed enough. And they'll tell right wing audiences to try and sort of amp up their xenophobic viewpoints. So yes, yeah, we looked at both of those. For our study, we looked at the video effect, the videos that we looked at Russia memes, and we gave everyone a media literacy video. It turned out the media literacy video was most effective with the right-wing audiences to help them decrease the number of likes on the right-wing content that Russia disseminates. We did not show an effect on the left-wing audiences and their proclivity to like Russian left-wing content.
All right, thank you, Dr. Helmus. Our next question comes from Frank Fan, and this question is: have you seen any studies mention counter misinformation and with misinformation strategies? For example, adopting web application injection techniques to replace misinformation once detected with major corruption news in adversary states.
No, I'm not familiar with that. So what is it that Russia is putting, what you can, an injection technique? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, it looks like the questioner is talking about, web application injection techniques to replace misinformation once detected with major corruption news stories in adversary states.
Yeah, I mean, if I would imagine that they are able to do that, and if they're able to do that, then that would probably be good, and achieve whatever ends the information campaign had. But I'm not familiar with it. I'm not seeing any studies looking at the effectiveness of it. Obviously, I would imagine such efforts would be on the classified side.
All right, thank you. Doug Bryant has asked if you've heard or he says that he's heard that some countries are more susceptible to Russian disinformation than others, like the United States versus France. Have you had a look at why is that and what we can learn from that?
I've not heard or seen studies that do that comparison, though there's a lot of research and it would be easy to not see it even if it existed. So I'm just not familiar with it. I think, the way Russia does its propaganda is it seeks to target partisans. So they're not looking to influence the middle of the road folks. They're trying to take audiences who are a little xenophobic and make them more xenophobic. They're trying to take audiences that are a little distrustful of government and make them more distrustful of government. So in my view, the countries that would be at risk from this propaganda would be countries that have people more on those margins that can be targeted. Russia, our view on Russian propaganda strategy and tactics is essentially that they are trying to sow distrust and division within society, certainly within American society, and they're doing this as well as in Europe, to pit conservative against liberal, to make conservatives more extreme, to make liberals more extreme. So I think countries that have that audiences for them to target, they'll be more receptive to it.
Gina Giles asked a related question, and that's what, if any, is a good approach for people with extreme positions? Because I know that Russia's specifically targeting those people. So what can, say, the US do to approach this issue?
For people with extreme positions, I mean, I think, what I would want to do is I think they need to, number one, they need to educate those audiences that they're targets. When they pull out these bulletins and these public warnings, they need to make sure that those public warnings are reaching those who are particularly at risk. They need to do more to do media literacy and education on those audiences, and it's fairly easy to do with social media now, because you can basically just add those folks into your ad targeting algorithm and then push out content to them. That's what Russia did. So, developing media literacy content for those audiences and then disseminate to them, I think will be important. And then I would also work to build civil society within those groups. So, just to take like liberals, for example, there are certainly organizations that do work with liberal political parties as there are with conservative political parties. And I would think it'd be important to do outreach amongst them to be able to improve their concern, their knowledge of, and their skills to counter this.
All right, thank you.
And also, I think doing more to bridge divides, political partisan divides, I think will be really, really important.
All right, thank you. So shifting gears slightly, Sugata Chakravarti has asked how propaganda can be differentiated from free speech and privacy issues.
Right, it's really hard. That's the challenge, because the Russian propaganda doesn't come with a label. It says Russian propaganda, and it looks a lot like partisan content. It looks indiscriminate from partisan content. So on its face, I think just looking at the content, it's hard to tell. So that's the challenge. I think part of the goal then for media literacy efforts is to help people think twice about who is sending this and what are they trying to do. Because the content is obviously meant to influence. And most of the time the content is targeting people's emotions. And it's not targeting factual information. If you review Russia's memes from 2016, very little of it is trying to disseminate factual information or even information that looks like a fact. Most of it is like a meme that has a picture of a conservative or a liberal, or some picture that shows, some guy crossing the Mexican border and look how terrible this is. This is evil. We can't stand to have this. When you see content like that, it's pretty obvious someone's trying to influence you. And you would hope that we can educate consumers to think, do I want to be influenced by that type of thing? So the problem is, though, one fundamental challenge is that they're oftentimes preaching to the choir. And so while you'd hope someone would look at that content and think, well, someone's really trying to, put one over on me on that, unfortunately, the people looking at it would be like, that's pretty awesome. I love that stuff. So it's a big challenge.
Indeed it is. All right, well, thank you. We have another question from Kirill Avramov. And this question is, how can academia be an engaged stakeholder in the process of propaganda mitigation?
I think they are, at least, I don't know, the folks I follow on Twitter seem to be actively engaged on this. I don't know, my viewpoint is someone who's in academia of sorts, that they are actively engaged. There's a lot of folks doing research on this topic, and there's a lot of folks hungry for funding to be able to do more research on this topic. So I don't think there's a problem with a lack of, a lack of folks wanting to do the research. Now, one might argue that they're doing the research wrong, or they have partisan viewpoints on this or that. The how they're doing it, I think, is open to discussion, and one can debate how they could do it better. But they're certainly trying to do it, and they're certainly engaged.
So that leads into a question from S.E. Gallagher about the role of the military. So he says that the U.S. military is starting to dedicate a lot of time and resources towards this issue. Although the military has a significant budget, the military is only a small part of the solution. What are your recommendations for leveraging military efforts more effectively and tying them more effectively into a whole of government approach by the U.S. government?
It's a good point. The very few of the studies that we looked at identified things the military needed to do. In our study back in 2018 that looked at confronting Russian propaganda in Eastern Europe, we did include a lot of military stuff in that because, I don't know, we're RAND, we have relations with the military. We visited UCOM on that topic. And so there we highlighted the need to do better messaging and information regarding exercises in Eastern Europe, to do more capacity building with Eastern European country militaries so that they can be able to carry their messaging on in their home countries. There needs to be better public affairs efforts for the military and NATO to be able to communicate what it's doing in these countries to promote support from the population for this, particularly given that Russia's trying to put a wedge between what NATO's doing and what these populations are doing. So a lot of their content is focused on that. So, there needs to be more sort of trust building efforts within populations who are at risk of Russian propaganda, like Russian speakers in Estonia. So that's one broad set of things. That's very regionally specific. I think the other things, the question is to what extent Russia the military wants to draw on other things that we talk about in our recommendations. So, for example, there's a need to train journalists in Eastern Europe. So is there a way for the military to be involved in that? Could NATO PAO officers work with host nation PAO officers to do more training and education on them? So when those people go into journalism or do journalism within their military responsibilities, that journalism could be more effective. It's more investigatorial. It does a better job of outing or detecting or fact checking Russian propaganda, then that would be helpful. I know to the extent that there's communication campaigns that DoD can fund or DoD can support the GEC doing, then that could be helpful. I would envision a campaign that would help, one can envision a campaign that could say, help people in Estonia, Russian speakers in Estonia feel like they belong to the Estonian government, to the Estonian people writ large. So maybe there's a role for the military to probably not do those campaigns, but to at least support those efforts, to do building capacity with those efforts, or support the GEC in doing those efforts. And I think I think a lot of the recommendations can be applied by the military, even though they're not military specific recommendations.
So Kirill Avramov's next question builds off of those target countries that you were specifying in, like, say, Eastern Europe or Central Europe. So he says, in essence, a highly politicized or politically polarized society that already has high levels of institutional distrust due to corruption. The targeting goes through meta narratives, push for undecided or fence sitters at the, in these nations. That represents a very big challenge too, correct?
Say it again.
Sorry if that was a jumble of words. I got lost at the beginning. So the question was, in essence, in highly politically polarized societies that already have high levels of institutional distrust due to corruption, the targeting goes through meta narratives, push for the undecided fence sitters, in particular in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. This is a very big challenge, correct?
So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah, if you want a one-word answer to the question, then yes, it's a challenge. I don't know. I think that kind of stuff is doable. We pitched a proposal that ultimately was not very successful to the GEC to do something along the lines of, basically what we wanted to do was to identify Russian speakers in Eastern Europe, do surveys to better understand who those speakers were, what their attitudes and viewpoints was, and to then segment the audience. Identify an influential segment within that audience, and then develop a media literacy campaign around that, and then target them with that media literacy campaign. So not everybody is reachable, unfortunately. I think the key is to identify your audience segment that you can reach. And there's probably two different roles here, right? One, if you can take those who are a little partisan and help protect them better, then that's great. Or you can take those who are in the middle and help protect them from this content and making them more partisan. And it's not, Russia's just not delivering this content to partisans right now, right? I mean, there's all sorts of, like, just to beat a dead horse with this Estonia and Ukraine example, there's all sorts of Russian speakers there that they're targeting. So they're trying to, like, communicate with everybody, though they probably recognize that there's only some they're going to influence more than others. But so I think anything that can help expand capabilities on this, like media literacy education, there's no harm in it. There's no side effects to it. It's a benign intervention in the sense of the risks and trade-offs. People only enhance their knowledge and skills from it. So you want to reach your target audience, but if you reach beyond that, then that's fine too. But you do have to assess the effectiveness of it. So there is a huge question of how effective these things are. And I think any campaign needs to be evaluated.
Right. Well, thank you, Dr. Helmus. An anonymous person asked if you have any thoughts on using counter CTI strategies to proactively mitigate against disinformation.
Sure, but what does CTI mean?
I believe, I'm not familiar with the acronym, but let's see.
Maybe they'll update that with a question. Maybe.
Okay. Yes. So we'll have
yes. Now counter CTI sounds really good, but I don't know what it is.
CTI. So I believe it has to do with counterterrorism. It's cyber threat intelligence. So the question is, do you have any thoughts on using counter cyber threat intelligence strategies to proactively mitigate against disinformation?
Counter cyber threat intelligence. No, I mean, as you can see, like for this study, the recommendations are pretty broad because the literature is pretty broad. So, when we talk about cyber capabilities, we can limit that description to a couple paragraphs in our report, but not much further than that. I didn't see anything about that particular type of counter threat intelligence. Counter threat intelligence. So I'm not sure, but it does make me think though how Russia used a fake, deep fake created image of an attractive woman on LinkedIn to be able to derive more U.S. government contacts on that LinkedIn thing. I don't know if that's what that's referring to, but there's certainly a need to do a lot of intelligence operations on this.
All right, thank you, Dr. Helmus, and my apologies for not being able to provide an explanation of what CTI is. Elizabeth Newman has asked a question that builds on the privacy issue. So she asks, have you had any conversations with policymakers on the research regarding the privacy issue? Has there been a positive response or an uptake that's bipartisan? Have you run into issues with the First Amendment and policy development? What challenges do you see, and how do you envision a workaround to this to protect Americans from misinformation and propaganda?
Those are really good questions. I don't have an answer for any of them, unfortunately. No, I did not talk with any policymakers about that particular piece. I know that there's legislation on the table, that there's a lot of talk about the privacy issue at large. I mean, the privacy issue goes much bigger than this Russian propaganda piece, right? So how our information is used online, Facebook, for example, collects all this information, and then they develop collaborations with other companies, and they share that data with those other companies. Now, that's not a threat from Russian propaganda, but it's a fundamental privacy threat, I think, and people might think. So, and to be honest, that privacy threat probably even outweighs the Russian propaganda threat. So I know that there's talk about regulations on these topics. I don't have a list of what sort of stuff, what regulations, what laws are on the docket to address that, but I know that that's a concern for a lot of people.
All right, thank you for tackling that multifaceted question. I know there was a lot in there. So the question is in the chat if you wanted to review anything else that was in there. That is currently the last question that we had in the Q&A chat. So Dr. Helmus, do you have any concluding remarks with regards to that question, or just to wrap us up with?
No, thank you. Just thank you everyone for having me here and for listening.
All right.
And good questions. So I appreciate the questions.
We covered a lot of ground in a short period of time. So thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. And thank you, Dr. Helmus, for your responses. So have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.